Welcome to The Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz. My podcast is about ideas, discussing ideas. And my guest today is here to do just that. We haven't pinned down just one topic, which is what I normally do. We're just going to discuss a few ideas that we want to discuss. Maybe we'll get locked into the first one that we start and never get anywhere else. If that happens, that's fine. This guy is very well educated. He's got so many accomplishments education wise. I can let him tell you. He's a friend of mine on Facebook. He certainly is very knowledgeable when it comes to philosophy and economics. Gerry Bourdeau, welcome to the show. Oh, he also has his own podcast, Argue With Me, right? Is the name of it?
Yeah, you got it.
And a Substack, Argue With Me. So it might not surprise you if we end up arguing. But
that's right.
We'll do so politely.
They're new, so if people go to look for it, there is some content, and I have regular content that'll be released soon. So, but I hope people like what they find.
Okay, so the first thing is I posted or I reposted a quote from Ayn Rand, and this was the first thing that you wanted to talk about. So let me just read the quote. The precept, judge not that ye be not judged, is an abdication of moral responsibility. It is a moral blank check one gives to others in exchange for a moral blank check one expects for oneself. There is no escape from the fact that men have to make choices. So long as men have to make choices, there is no escape from moral values. So long as moral values are at stake, no moral neutrality is possible. To abstain from condemning a torturer is to become an accessory to the torture and murder of his victims. The moral principle to adopt is judge and be prepared to be judged. Okay, so let's just get right to it. What's your issue?
Yeah, my issue here is that it's not so much with the first part, which is the what was it? Judge not lest you be judged thyself, something like that. I mean, that might be good advice in certain situations where you need mercy.
No, she's saying to judge. She's her point.
Oh, no, I know. I heard the first part of the quote though was judge not lest ye be judged yourself. I just want to.
Okay, you're right.
I just want to make it clear that that's not really my position either. So I don't want people to think I'm defending the first line of that explanation.
Here to deliver the Sermon on the Mount, folks, is Gerry Bourdeau.
but I basically don't agree with the premise that people make choices for which they can be judged. Okay. So, and I'll try to put this like in as maybe as intuitive way as I can here, which is that obviously, first of all, to put my cards on the table, I'm a hard determinist, right? Like I don't think that there's any room for people to have chosen otherwise to begin with, which is the usual conception of what people say when they're talking about free will, right? And I also am not a compatibilist, so I find compatibilists a little strange. Those are people who think determinism is true, but that free will is compatible with it. That's I think the majority of philosophers today, and I won't get into that too far, except that what people seem to think when they're talking about compatibilism is that they have an experience of like deliberation, they have an experience of what feels like decision making, and to them that is good enough, or that's something similar to free will, even if they accept that the universe is deterministic. And the reason I think that's an error is, and I make an analogy about this on my Substack, is I think we're more like a Roomba. You know, the little vacuum robots that you put into a room and they go around and they suck stuff up. And that like Roombas look like they're making a choice, and they are, in a sense, they are deliberating. But the reason they're doing that is because they don't have complete information about what's in that room, right? So they have an algorithm that's coded into them about deciding what to do next. And they're just learning as they go what's in that room, and then their algorithm's telling them what direction to go next. And I think that's akin to our sense of deliberation, where it's not that we have a choice about our programming or what we're going to do next, but we will deliberate because we don't have complete information. So it takes some time for our coding to figure out what we should do next, in light of the fact that we just don't know what every variable in the universe is. So I think where this gets me, and I'll stop in 10 seconds here, I swear, is that if we are like Roombas, where we just have an internal like program that takes in information and does its best to make a choice based on what the programming is. I mean, I think it would be as silly to blame a Roomba for a choice as, I'm using choice in a different way, like for playing out its algorithm, if you will. As I think it would be as silly to blame that as it would be to blame a human for playing out its algorithm. And then I think the whole judgmental portion of this kind of drops out of the picture.
Okay, so you said that, and you said a lot. So if I get something
Yeah.
wrong, feel free to correct me.
No sweat.
You said that we're deliberating because we don't have all the information, even though the end is already set. So, like, if I'm thinking right now, what should I do? And I'm going through all the options in my head, and then I say, okay, I want to pick up the mouse. You can't see it. Okay, there it is, right? It was already set that I was going to pick up the mouse, but I deliberated because I wasn't aware that I was going to pick up the mouse.
Yeah, like from your
Okay.
point of view, you don't know that you're going to pick up the mouse, but that doesn't mean that in principle it was unknowable that you were going to pick up the mouse.
Okay. Now, the deliberation that you're talking about is each thought in each sub thought in each half thought and every inkling of any motivation. Is that all determined as well?
Yeah, I would say it is all determined, and in fact, you could go as deep as you want into whatever physical theory you like, and you're
Yeah.
going to find a reason.
Okay. It's very important. So the consciousness that we have is completely superfluous. We don't really need it. It doesn't do anything. I mean, from an evolutionary standpoint, right? If the action is going to happen anyways, the deliberation is completely useless and we have no control over it. What would be the point of consciousness in that sense?
Yeah, well, actually, so it depends on how you're going to define consciousness. Now, what I tend to think of as consciousness is basically a part of us that notices other parts of us. It's like a part of us that can notice a thought coming from another portion, or if you want to get down to it, I think it's like a set of neurons, a neural network that notices other neural networks doing things. And then from that perspective, I do think there is a reason that it would exist from a game theoretic point of view, because it can be very helpful to have deliberation, right, in the face of a lack of information. So
But
again,
the deliberation
yeah,
doesn't affect. Sorry to
yeah,
interrupt you, but the deliberation
that's
doesn't
okay.
affect the result. That's
Well,
what you said before.
no, from your point of view, it will seem to affect the result,
But it really doesn't.
well, no, it from a third person omniscient
It means
viewer,
nothing,
that's right, but
which means it's
that there's
useless.
nothing
That's my
special
point.
about consciousness.
Well,
Well,
that's
there's
my
nothing
point.
special. Well, but I think we're breaking up a little bit with the timing.
Oh,
Is there? Okay, sorry. Yeah,
okay. Go ahead.
I think we're talking over each other, but not intentionally. So there's nothing really special about consciousness from that point of view, though, right?
Okay.
Like your heart beating is going to, well, it's a mechanistic thing that will keep you moving around. Consciousness will also help you to keep moving around, whether the nature of consciousness is what you think or not. It still could serve a purpose mechanistically, right? So yeah, I'm not sure that consciousness is like a special case in that sense.
Okay. Just so the audience knows, I'm going to pause a little extra so we don't have that timing issue. So if it seems like I'm like taking a long time or Jerry's taking a long time to answer that, that's what I'm doing. I don't want us to have some kind of a digital freak out over here. If that's even the proper way to describe it, I don't know. Okay. But the heartbeat serves a definite purpose, a mechanistic purpose, right? But in what you said, the action is going to take place. The consciousness doesn't affect it. The deliberate, I don't even know what the word would be. The deliberation process doesn't actually affect the action. So the
Oh
deliberation
no.
process itself is completely useless. It doesn't matter.
Well, no, I would say the deliberation process matters just as much as the heartbeat in the exact same way, in that when you have one cluster of neurons noticing something, another cluster of neurons isn't noticing, then you're going to have a different outcome than if it wasn't there, right?
Okay,
It's yeah.
Okay, so the neurons are interacting with each other in a mechanistic way that's going to determine an outcome, and the deliberative process is just something that we experience happening, but it has nothing to do with the physical things that are actually taking place. As far
Yeah,
as
well,
controlling them.
it has nothing. Well, it will affect things physically, but it won't affect it in some special way that like anything else, like dropping a chair or something, wouldn't affect the universe physically, right? Like your deliberation is doing something. It is you can picture it like a computer with two processors, and one processor keeps an eye on the other to make sure it's doing its job. It's, you know what I mean? It's not exactly analogous, but it gives you a sense of how something that we wouldn't usually classify as like living will be doing sort of the same thing.
Okay.
So
Well, here, this is my question, and this is the last I'm going to talk, and then I want to go in a different direction with the same topic.
sure.
So why would neurons, in this sense, right? If you have an evolutionary process, if it could create these neurons to interact in such a way that they're going to pick up the mouse or vacuum the room, whatever, what would the purpose serve of having sort of experiencing this deliberative process that we feel like we're in control of and directing, but we're really not? Like, what evolutionary
Oh, okay.
purpose could that serve?
Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure that the experience of consciousness necessarily serves an evolutionary purpose. In
Okay.
fact, I've never really drilled down on that. It's more like I don't know if you could have consciousness without experiencing it. It might be the experience might be a byproduct, really. It's more so that I do understand what like the prefrontal cortex is basically what we're talking here about here, how having a machine that will watch the less evolved portions of your brain and intervene when it notices them going haywire in a way that won't help the overall organism. I can totally see the benefit to that, and it might be, and I don't know that the experience is ancillary. I've never really thought about
But it
that
would
too
still
much.
make the experience useless.
It might like well, look, we're saying useless as if we've already like decided that we both agree on what meaning is,
I
but
mean
from
useless
the
toward the end that ends up achieving. I don't mean useless in the term of having some sort of utility. I just mean if you have the vacuum cleaner going around the room
yeah.
that you're saying, the vacuum cleaner is going to do what it's going to do. If somehow you were to superimpose conscious experience onto it, but it's still going to do the same thing, then the conscious experience is useless. That's what I mean. It's not affecting anything in the sort of in the equation.
Right. Well, I guess if yeah, if you wanted to define it that way, that the disappearance of the consciousness wouldn't affect the outcome, then by definition it's useless in the sense of vacuuming a room or whatever the end goal is that we're deciding for this conversation. However, I don't think that that's like the actual case, right? If you define it that way, sure, but that's just tautological. I actually do think that the Roomba, for example, if it was unable to sense something and then deliberate about where to go, would not vacuum the room properly, right? Like it would have a harder time. And then human beings are even better uh, than a Roomba at vacuuming the room because our brains are more complicated and able to have more information, right? So like I can see how consciousness would ramp up as a useful thing, but I take to the point that the experience of consciousness might just be what it is without any sort of usefulness on its own.
Okay. This is really where there's a lot of different arguments. I mean, my first person experience, I experience myself making decisions. I know that your position is that we really don't experience it that way, that we don't really experience ourselves freely making decisions. But I would argue do. We can get to that in a minute. But this is where a lot of the problems come in with arguments against free will. For instance, you said that Ayn Rand's I don't know, the recommendation in that quote of what people ought to be doing. You said it's just silly to hold people responsibility for their actions because they're not making free choices. But that statement of yours implies that we have a choice whether to hold people responsible for their choices or not.
Oh, okay. I see. So I'll clear up a couple things here. I was specifically actually talking about the judgment aspect of
Yep.
the quote, right? So it might still be that you want to make certain incentives for people without ascribing a moral blameworthiness or
Okay.
a moral. And notice I use the word you might like to do it, right? Like we all might, and I'll come back to your other point in a second, but
Mhm.
we all might have the preference to not be killed by one another, right? So that doesn't really require like a moral anything. We could just have that preference, so we could
Okay.
grant that, and then we might all agree on certain rules that we want to hold people to for that purpose, right? So I think that the portion that I'm suggesting, I'm not saying that there's just no reason ever to like um remove somebody from society, for example, but I would picture it more like a blameless quarantining than I would like a punishment with judgment behind it. So that's the first thing I wanted to clarify.
Okay.
The second thing was this concept of like, well, wouldn't we all just do it anyway, type of thing. So I'm not saying that change doesn't happen. We're not in a static universe where there's no such thing as change. We're obviously in a physical system that updates. And if you, Michael, apprehend a new fact, right, that will affect the way that you will proceed. Now, it's true that you will not be able to predict that necessarily, but in principle, it was predictable,
Okay.
right? So, yeah.
Okay. I didn't think you were saying we were in a static universe. What I mean is this: Ayn Rand says this is what we should do, right?
Yeah.
That implies that the person that she's speaking to has a choice whether or not to do it. She says judge. That implies that I have the option to judge or not judge.
Mm-hmm.
Gerry Bourdeau comes along and says, no, I don't think we should judge. That too implies that there's a choice in the matter. Otherwise, if there's determinism, right? If determinism's straight all the way down the line, then Ayn Rand is determined to make her statement. The people that she's suggesting we judge are determined to act in the way that they act. And Gerry Bourdeau is determined to come to the conclusion and say the things about it that he does. So
Mm-hmm.
everything in the whole thing is determined, including this conversation. So my thoughts and my beliefs and my statements are all determined. Your thoughts, your beliefs, and your statements are all determined. So it's at that point, I mean, how do you, like, even to make a recommendation implies that somebody has the option. And not only that, but when you go through the logical process to learn, should we judge, should we not, what's ethical behavior, what's not, it implies that you have the ability to reject certain evidence, examine evidence, discount certain statements, consider different arguments. All of that implies that there's an element of choice. Because if there isn't, well, then it's all just going to happen. It doesn't mean change doesn't happen, but the very change you're talking about is determined as well. Every element of
Yeah.
it is.
Well, so I agree with all of the things you said, but with a different context entirely, I think, right?
Okay.
So like I agree that all of the things, my recommendation, Ayn Rand's recommendation, this conversation, were in principle knowable because they are determined. They were all going to happen. I totally agree with that. That said, again, and it seems like we agree, we're in a universe that does change. It's not static. So it doesn't mean that because all of this was going to happen, that it's somehow not useful for it to happen, right? So like, for example, we might still, like we said, we have experiences. I'm not arguing that human beings don't feel anything, and we have preferences. I think I'm not arguing that that's not the case. And it could be that by like the system known as Gerry sharing information with the system known as Michael, that somehow our mutual understanding will actually improve our experience and achieve our preferences, right? Now, it could still very well be true that that was always going to happen, but that doesn't mean that it didn't improve anything or that it didn't augment our experience in some way. So, for example, it might be the fact that classic liberalism was always going to happen, right? The idea was always going to come up, but I'm still happy that I live in a time where that idea exists and is something that different systems can share with each other, versus a time prior to that when it didn't, even though all of this was going to happen anyway. I don't know if that clears it up for you, but
No, I get it. It's just that if you're saying that everything's determined, then even your sense of what an improvement is, even your preferences are all determined. Even like I don't know if you're familiar with what's his name now, Harry Frankfurter,
no,
and
I don't know him.
well, he wrote about preference values, basically preferences, and first level preferences and second level preferences. And what he was saying is that we could have a preference of wanting to do something, but we could also have a secondary preference where we wish we didn't have the first preference. So, for instance, a drug addict wants to go get high, right? But there's a part of him that says, damn, I wish I didn't want to do this. Now, I know because of the type of change that I had to do as both a drug addict and a criminal, that plays a pivotal role. So I have this preference. I want to fight. I want to be violent. Somebody, quote unquote, disrespects me. I want to hurt them. But I also know that that's leading me nowhere, so I have to change it. So I make an effort to use the second order preference to displace the first order preference. But under a deterministic universe, all that's determined. First order preference, second order preference, whether I'll implement it or not, how much effort I'm going to put into it. The whole thing down the line is determined, and it's just a pointless thing. Like, it doesn't mean anything. Because to say, well, I think you should do this or you shouldn't judge. Like I said, you're implying choice because you're giving a should. Otherwise, it's just a mechanistic reaction. There's neurons firing in your brain that are a response to something in the environment. Ultimately, they dictate that you're going to, these vibrations are going to come out of your mouth. They're going to be picked up by somebody else's receiving equipment that's in their ear, get funneled through their, neuronal system, and then they're going to act on it. It's all just ultimately can be boiled down to physical systems. And then at that point, it just is meaningless to say somebody should or shouldn't do something. Of course, the problem with my end of it is that if determinism is true, then you would be completely determined to use the term should or not. And that's kind of what I mean by it just ends up in a sort of a web of, I don't madness. I don't know what other word to use, because none of it ends up making sense. The very way that we communicate with one another doesn't make sense.
Okay, so I mean, ultimately, everything might be meaningless. I don't know. I certainly think that I have preferences still, and it matters to me whether that matters or not. Ultimately, whether I get those preferences, that's almost tautological again. That's what a preference is, really. But I'm not sure that your description about how people change is quite accurate based on my understanding of the human brain. So, for example, it's true that people will, and this is everybody, often be unable or mostly be unable to explain where their thoughts come from. They have thoughts first, and even will decide to move a part of their body or pick something arbitrary, then consciously be aware of it after. But if you ask them, why did you pick that thing? They will always have a story, because the left hemisphere, for most of us, the left hemisphere, that's a huge part of its purpose, is it will provide context to anything. And you can actually sever the corpus callosum in a human brain and start asking questions. Like the right hemisphere will be severed from the left hemisphere, but the right hemisphere controls the left side of your body. This can all be inverted with different people.
Sure.
So one side of your body might do something like pick up a pencil or a card or something like this. And then you can ask your left hemisphere, which controls language and context, why you just did that, and it will come up with a story.
Okay.
And we know it's not true. Also, if you hear certain things that I say to you, right, like probably nothing in this conversation, but I'm sure this has happened to you and everybody else in the past. If I just say like the number 2 added to the number 2 is equal to the number 4, you will just be helpless if you've understood what I've said. You
Yeah.
will be helpless to believe that. It's not like a choice you're going to make. You will know that 2 + 2 is 4 in that sense, right? And
Yeah.
I think honestly that happens more than often. And I don't want to I'm nearly through here too, but I don't want to personalize this to you. But
You
a lot
can.
of a lot of what people like when people change, a lot of it is a combination of a bunch of different things. Sometimes it's simply that as we get older, our prefrontal cortex takes over more, and then rational deliberation, as we're describing it here, becomes more possible. Your hindbrain is not as in control as your prefrontal cortex anymore. So your brain is operating on different programming. That can actually change the way your genetics are what's the word, coded, and also how proteins are encoded. It can change your behavior completely, and even things I tell you might change your behavior without you with you just involuntarily just accepting what I told you, right? So like that 2 + 2 is 4 is a good example of that. The next time, somebody's at the grocery store or whatever, making change or whatever they have to reason through, right? So anyway, people change for a whole bunch of different reasons, and I find we often overrate entirely actually effort.
Okay. A couple things on that right there. First of all, you're
Sure.
talking about in criminal psychology, it's called the maturation hypothesis, that as criminals get old, they just sort of mature out of it. Now you gave a lot of the technical brain stuff as far as what happens, but that is part of it. There's some truth to it, statistically, but not in a deterministic thing that every criminal that grows old grows out of it. That's not
Yeah.
true.
Yeah. I would.
It is true that crime does tend to lessen in criminals as they get older. But I wasn't suggesting, when I use the second order preferences analogy or theory of Harry Frankfurter, that that's how everybody changes, or even that that's all there is to it. There's a far more to it. You know what I mean? I was just using it to explain that that's a part of it, is realizing that my values had to change, that I have these and there's still some of them that crop up or pop up, creep up, something they do, but they come up to cause emotional reactions in me, and I have to defer or put off acting on those impulses that I get. So that still happens. And the effort that it takes for a criminal to change is monumental. Now, of course, here's the thing, and this goes back to the deterministic thing. If determinism's true, then the experience of putting forth effort is determined. Everything along the line is determined. But what I'm talking about is I know the difference, and I'm sure you do too, between putting forth effort and not putting forth effort. Whether it's completely determined or not is not really relevant. You know the difference, or you could have never said it. And I can tell you from myself and other criminals that I know have changed. And what the late Dr. Samanow said is that Stanton Samanow said there's no endeavor more difficult on this planet than for a criminal to become a responsible person. And he said that after decades of studying criminal personality. So that's that. Now, back to the original thing you were talking about in this, when you talked about the severed brain and how the left brain will concoct a story about what's occurring. That's true. The problem is that's an abnormal circumstance. You're talking about severing the two halves of the brain from one another, and then the left side concocts a story. We don't know that that's what occurs when a brain is completely intact. We know that's what happens in an abnormal situation. The problem with that, Gerry, is if that's what's occurring, then your left brain may have concocted the entire story about determinism. So why would anybody accept it if it's just a concoction of your left brain?
Okay. Yeah. So,
Get my water.
what? Yeah, no problem.
Go ahead. I'm ready.
I'm just writing down so I can remember to respond. But so the first thing about effort, I definitely agree with you that we both will experience effort, or not effort, whatever, laziness, whatever it is. Like we do experience things. We have sensory inputs, but I think that where we might not see eye to eye is the direction of causality on this one, right? I think that something will cause you to put in effort. I don't think that your effort will cause you to change. if that makes sense. And I think I don't want to debate about that too much more, because I think we'll get stuck into that for a long time. So I'll
Yeah.
let you have the last word on it
Yeah.
if you don't agree, but I just wanted to make my position clear on it. So
No, I actually, I don't agree, but that's not my point. My point is just that if it's all determined, then there's no way, then yes, the effort would be determined. I'm just saying that in the normal course of observation, there's an experience of a lot of effort when it comes to changing. That's all.
Yeah.
That's all I'm saying.
So we both agree to that.
Okay.
So then the other thing is, you were saying that this is the example I cited about cutting the corpus callosum is
Yes.
as an example of a strange brain. And it is an example of a strange brain, but it's also an example of a really great experiment to show you what your brain does and what the different portions of it are. Now, that doesn't, you're right, prove that a normal brain would concoct things quite the same way. However, we have other reasons to think that it does. And it doesn't mean that people are completely irrational. It means that human beings don't like things that they can't explain, especially coming from themselves. And they are very, I mean, our brains are super complicated. So I do think you have a point there, except also to say that if the example I was giving was explaining where thoughts come from, that's what I was talking about. So Sam Harris has who we might
I knew
have.
that's who you were getting this from, by the way.
No, it's not. He has
in part.
He has the best example of this, I think, is why I want to bring him up. This is stuff that existed. Not that I'm disrespecting Sam Harris either. No. This is stuff that existed well before him. But he has this example on a TED talk he gave of like, think of a city, right? And then you're going to have cities pop into your brain, whatever it is. I won't bother. Lisbon, Tokyo, whatever. I don't know what he says in the talk, but something like that. And then if he asks you to tell me why you thought of that city, you will always have a story for it. And we do these studies on people. And the answer is really, actually, your brain thought of it before you were even aware of it. So your story post hoc is just that. It's post hoc, right? So a lot of our conscious experience is like that. And I actually think most of it is like that. But that doesn't mean that human beings are incapable of reason. In fact, that's like a hyper reasoning mechanism, isn't it? It's like trying to find reason everywhere.
It's a rationalization mechanism.
Yeah. Well, you're right. Okay, so that's a better way of putting it. But then the question becomes like, why would anyone accept what I'm saying? But that's not really an argument. So I could be making stuff up that is also true. Right? You would have to like investigate that for yourself. I don't think that the state of my brain necessarily.
Well, no.
Yeah.
Gerry, in the example you gave, the left brain fabricated something that was not true.
Yes, in that example, but that's not the example you gave, right?
What I'm saying is, if the brain does that, then how would we know your brain's not doing it?
Well, you shouldn't necessarily. It might be in certain things, right? And we have different ways of trying to get our brains to stop doing that. And I'm sure actually that my brain is doing some of that right now, or maybe even a lot. You'll have to make a judgment on your end about whether you can trust anything I'm saying. But I mean, I'm going to have to do the same, and we all have to do that. So I don't have I just don't think that impairs anything I'm saying worse than
but Gerry, it wouldn't be limited to you.
No,
it would also apply to me.
I also think it's the case.
So my brain's concocting a story too, and I have no choice about it. That's what I'm saying, is that like, why would we trust anything anybody says? Because the bottom line is we might just be making it all up. But Sam Harris, you know, I read his book Free Will. I also read his book The Moral Landscape and The End of Faith. And I've listened to a ton of his podcasts, and there's parts that Sam Harris says that I agree with 100%. There's also parts where I find he contradicts himself woefully when he gets into the determinism. Now, he talks about that if you really introspect, you'll see that you're not in charge of your thoughts, that you don't create your thoughts. First of all, he implies that I have the choice whether to put forth the effort and introspect or not. That's the first point. But I know that I have some OCD, not serious OCD, but enough of it to where I know the difference, for instance, between an intrusive thought in a thought that doesn't bother me, a thought that keeps coming up. I know what it's like to try to dispel thoughts. I know that I can dispel some, I can't dispel others. I can differentiate between effort and non-effort, like we talked before. I can differentiate between somebody picking me up and carrying me against my will and walking from here to there on my own. My only point in all this is that the empirical data, and when I say empirical data, I don't just mean things outside of my head. I consider introspection to be empirical as well. It's observation of the world, of what's going on in the world. What I mean by that is it's not nativist in the sense that it's not inborn ideas or an automatic knowledge. It's actually something that's taking place. The neurons in my head take place. The consciousness takes place. But my point is that I can differentiate between those things that are determined and things that aren't. Now, the argument that a Sam Harris would make is that it's an illusion that I'm having, or a mistake I'm making in assuming these things aren't. But I would put it back on him. Well, prove that. What's the evidence for that? If I can come up with all these differentiations between things that take effort, between rationalizations, not rationalizations, a reasoning process, and just accepting things because I'm told to, then you have to, not you personally, but anybody making the argument for determinism has to refute that. And inevitably, they end up relying on the concept of choice to do so, because Sam Harris says he believes in morality. So he says people should behave this way, they should not behave that way. Well, that implies choice. I know you don't believe in morality, but he does. Yeah. And then if you say, well, do an exercise in introspection, you're implying I have the choice to do the exercise. All that together, to me, leads to an acceptance of free will as nearly axiomatic, because to try to argue against it necessarily implies that you're using it.
I don't see how. Well, first of all, I just get the easy part of this out of the way, that obviously I'm not Sam Harris, and I know I'm not.
No, I know.
But
we talked about him, so I use this example.
That's fine. But I'm not going to then all of a sudden switch and say you ought to do this or that morally. I assure you. But I think that I'm not sure that I accept how you're describing like your experience of. So you're saying you notice intrusive thoughts, and it's like, well, I don't. Do you have a choice but to notice intrusive thoughts? I don't think so. But I guess what it would come down to, like, and I think this is what most neurologists would say, is you are going to need to find a neuron that fires for no reason. That's what you're going to need to find to explain what you're describing here, because we've not found that. In fact, we find the exact opposite every time that the tests are done. And it does seem like we have competing networks noticing each other. And you could just accept that, like, you're noticing some part of you, which I think is the part people mean when they say me. We're very loose with language, right? Like if I pointed at your hand and said, "Is that you?" You'd say, "Yeah, that's me," right? Like maybe if you're being very careful, you wouldn't, but in everyday life, most people would do that. But I think really what people think of what they mean when they say me is to the part of them that notices the other parts of them. And there just isn't a reason why that part shouldn't be determined to do that. It doesn't, there's no implication there that it
But
should.
what is the proof that it is determined? I mean, to say no reason why it should be.
I gave you. Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry, the neurons that you're talking about firing. My knowledge of neurology is nowhere enough to really get into individual neurons firing. So, but I will say this: I do know that there's evidence that not only does the brain affect thoughts, but that thinking affects the brain. That the way a person thinks can alter the brain. In other words, cognitive therapy is taught that the way you think alters the brain. There's the Pesso-Boyden psychology or therapy. They teach that the way that you think, it actually alters the physical structures of the brain. So to say that the neurons fire without reason, well, no, they wouldn't. They'd be firing in response to the thinking. So it's just I don't know enough when it comes to that. I just know that thinking can alter the brain, and I'm by no means saying that actions are taking place completely without reason, as if independent of the entire universe. my understanding of free will, my the basic elements of free will, and I get it from Ayn Rand. I didn't create it on myself. Is that the fundamental choice that we have is to focus or not. And I certainly inside my head can notice when I'm putting forth the effort to focus and when I'm not. Now, I know the argument would be, well, you're determined too. And that's where we end up at an impasse, because there's no way to prove it or to disprove it. My argument would just be, in the very act of trying to disprove it, you're assuming it.
Yeah, see, like I don't agree that no evidence has been
I said
adduced here, right?
proof. I know I said proof.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if it's possible. We're going to get into an epistemic discussion. I don't know if it's possible to prove anything 100% anyway, but I think that as long as we're talking about proof, I will talk just for a second about evidence. And to me, the evidence is very clear when in every experiment we've ever done that conservation laws are laws. We've never seen them broken. I've never seen an example of a scientific experiment, from physics to biology to chemistry to whatever, where conservation gets broken. And I do think for free will, where you could have chosen to do otherwise, you would have to break the law of conservation somehow. And I could get more into that, but that's going to be a whole other thing where I'm going to have to start drawing things too. But suffice to say, I want to touch on your idea about thoughts affecting the brain, which is I think true but not precise, right? So it's true that some neurons firing will affect the physiological makeup of your brain. And in fact, when we're born, I think people picture our brains becoming more complicated over time in their neurological patterns. But actually, what we go through is something called synaptic pruning. So we're born with tons and tons and tons of neurons and synapses, and then our brain takes in sensory information, interprets it based on the coding that already exists in us, and it starts to prune off all these different useless, like non-use. It sort of makes patterns the way a guy that makes what was the word I'm looking for here? Somebody that makes statues out of rock.
A sculptor.
A sculptor. Thank you. A sculptor makes patterns, in that they're taking away instead of adding to. And so it's still very possible for neurons to sense something, to put it through that processing and change the physiological makeup of your brain. And we're even finding out now that forever we thought that neurons, you start with a certain number and you never generate any more. And that's not true. You actually do. So I'm not surprised. Like, I don't think that really doesn't jive with what I'm saying elsewhere in the conversation.
Just to button this conversation up, because I know we're not going to agree, and I think we're not going to end up repeating ourselves, but it's been a good discussion. I want to move on to something else. But it's also true, right, that as the synaptic pruning, well, first of all, synaptic pruning makes sense, because we don't need all this useless stuff in our heads just clogging things up, right? So evolutionarily, it makes sense to get rid of these. But there's also new connections get made, right, as we get older. So in one sense, it is simplifying, but also I don't know if complicating it is the right word, but there are new connections that are always being made as long as we're learning and growing, right?
Well, do you want to know? I'll tell you something interesting, I hope, about that in no way will bother you, or get back into a debate about determinism. I actually think the reason that we've evolved that way to do the synaptic pruning is because our bodies don't know what kind of environment exactly we're coming out into. And if you start out with a whole wad of nerves and then you prune out the ones you're not using, it's a lot more efficient than having to build neurological connections from the ground up, as if like you'd almost have to know in advance what you were going to experience, right, for that to be the case. So anyway, but that's just an interesting, like, game theoretic evolutionary point. It has nothing to do with determinism.
No, but it's a good point. You're a smart guy. That's why I wanted you here. All right. I want to change the subject a little bit to politics. And I think here we're going to actually agree a lot more.
Probably.
So I've made a thing about it on social media. Not that there's millions of people that know it, but the people that are on my social media know it. And for more than 20 years, I called myself a libertarian. The reason I did so is because I look up libertarianism in the dictionary, and it says somebody who believes that the purpose of the government is just to protect the, the life, the liberty, and the property of people, or people should be free to do anything as long as they don't infringe on the freedom of somebody else to do the same. And that makes sense. And I read, going back to Locke and Frederick Bastiat, Adam Smith, I read all the classical liberal and libertarian thinkers, not all, but a significant amount. And the political program describe me, even though, I mean, Mises, for instance, is a utilitarian. I'm not. Friedman's a utilitarian, but I agreed with the basic prescriptions that they would make for public policy for the most part. Since getting out of prison now, I've seen a lot of wacky stuff from my perspective, people calling themselves libertarians. I'll put them out. For instance, the Mises Caucus of the Libertarian Party. They post a lot of just very like hateful stuff, it seems to me, towards Israel. Not just making arguments about, Israel's going too far, which I disagree with, but they would make that'd be, people can disagree about that kind of stuff, but just really ridiculous arguments. I don't want to get into them just now because this is about my thought process, and that's ultimately what I want to talk to you about. Also, I see like pop culture libertarians that call themselves libertarians, but aren't, they don't know the history or the arguments that are made. One thing coming out of the Mises Caucus from Alabama, for instance, is they posted a picture of the Unabomber, not the real Ted Kaczynski, but remember when they were looking for him and they had the
drawing,
guy,
yeah.
So they have that, and they have a quote from Ted Kaczynski, and then it says R.I.P. Uncle Ted, right? That's not something I want to be associated with. So you've been out, you weren't in prison, obviously. So my question is, have you had a similar experience with the libertarian movement? That there's just, Jeffrey Tucker put it well to me. He said words are supposed to differentiate things so that you know what you're talking about. When they no longer do that, they're not useful. And I'm just so different in my approach to life than the people I'm talking about that the word's not useful for me. So have you noticed this type of stuff with pop culture libertarianism or the Libertarian Party, that type of thing? What has been your experience, actually?
Okay.
Better way to ask the question.
Let me preface this by just reminding you and potentially anybody who saw my first appearance on the podcast, I'm Canadian. So I mentioned this for a couple of reasons. For one thing, for me to find another libertarian around here, I'm going to have to look for a really long time. It's really unlikely. However, I do have some Canadian sensibilities, some sort of classic Canadian sensibilities, in that I like when people are, I don't want to say going along to get along, because that implies people are doing something that they don't agree with. But I like it when people are sort of on the same page about what's polite and what's not polite, and have like a human understanding about that.
Right.
And I often see things from I have a lot of American friends on my Facebook, um, um, and not necessarily from my friends, but things people share. I see things in the wild that I think are a little outrageous, and the Unabomber thing is a really good example of that type of thing. And I think that where it comes from is, and maybe I can tie this into our conversation about the development of the brain, but without getting back into the neurobiology of it. Look, you have your story of redemption and growing up and that sort of thing. When I was a younger man, well, I'm turning 40 in December, so I'm not super old either. But when I was a young man, I was a lot angrier than I am now. In fact, I'm not angry at all now, despite the fact that certain things might bother me. I've learned over time to not get angry, because I find that context kills anger. And when you read more about history or different scientific papers, and you start to understand a little more, when you take the time to stop and really think about how things work rather than getting riled up, it's harder to get angry. And I find that lots of people call themselves libertarians, which is, like you, a term that I sometimes worry about ascribing to myself. Although I don't usually fight about it if somebody brings it up. A lot of libertarians are libertarians because they're angry. They think they've been screwed over. They're never going to be able to afford a house, or whatever it is, gold's not around as much anymore, or whatever they're angry about. And this gives them an excuse, or almost like a group of people they can get together with to be angry. And I think that's like, it certainly doesn't fulfill my preferences at all, because like I would rather find a group of people I can talk to and reason with and learn from. Um, and I also don't think that it's like a sustainable way to get any sort of liberty, to be just a group, an angry, hateful mob, because it's like, okay, you guys want control, but you're like the antithesis of who I want to have controlling things, because you know what I mean? Like, it's like, are you sure you're in this for the right reasons? You know what liberty means? Because like, it's, some people are gonna, like, anyway, you would expect that one reason I like the idea of libertarianism, or capitalism, or anarcho-capitalism, or whatever private property thing you want to talk about, is that it's supposed to push the most reasonable, rational, reliable people into positions where they're the ones making more and more decisions. Now, you voluntarily will push them into those positions if the incentives are correct, right? But where are those incentives in the Libertarian Party in the United States? They don't exist. So I have no reason to think that a pop culture libertarian, or a Mises whatever, like, I like Mises the guy, but
Me too.
yeah, I don't have any reason to expect they'd behave any better than any other like group
Yeah.
looking for attention out of anger.
Yeah,
So, yeah.
that's part of what irritates me with the Mises Caucus is they've appropriated Mises's name for stuff that he would not support. Look, if you want to be an anarchist, be an anarchist. That's your business. I mean, I'll debate, I'll argue with you about it, but it doesn't mean I'm not going to like you or we can't be friends. But you're taking the Mises Caucus, which basically advocate anarchy. They could say that, not all of us, but it's in the platform that you can have secession down to the individual, and that defense should be privatized to the maximum extent possible. So I don't know how that's not. It doesn't turn out to be an anarcho-capitalist or an anarchist society. But Mises explicitly said that can't work, that anarchy cannot work. You have to have a state. Now, if you want to argue with Mises, fine. I don't have an issue with that, but don't then take his name and say this, we're the Mises Caucus.
Yeah.
That type of thing irks me. And then they actually, some of them argued with me and said, well, anarcho-capitalism didn't really exist when Mises was around, so we can't really say he wouldn't have supported it. As far back as 1922, he said anarchism is neither a liberal or socialist. And liberal he was using in the classical sense, because the argument was he was criticizing left-wing anarchism. But he explicitly said that's not what he's talking about. So then to try to appropriate his name, I just find it to be woefully distasteful. And that might come to my sensibilities. Like you're
Well,
talking.
yeah, I agree with you completely. I mean, I don't agree necessarily about the like the whole anarchist question there, about whether it's a good idea or bad idea to be an anarcho-capitalist. That's a aside. I do agree that appropriating somebody who obviously didn't hold that position is a little strange as a mascot, but especially because, come on, we all know it's the Murray Rothbard Hans Hermann Hoppe caucus, isn't it?
Yes.
It's not the Mises caucus. Like, I know it's, and you know what? Fine, just call yourself that then. Like, I don't
I
know.
agree.
Yeah.
I agree.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things Murray Rothbard said that I agree with. His
Yeah.
book, Man, Economy, and State, is, in my view, either first or second best economics text written. I love it. I think it's wonderful. But Mises was not Rothbard. I disagree with Rothbard's anarchism, but tell me you're a Rothbardian and we can have a discussion. But when you throw Mises in, why? What is the motivation there? It's makes me wonder. I can't prove it. I don't know it, but my suspicion is that the name Mises brings more credibility in libertarian or classical liberal circles than does a Rothbard or a Hoppe, which I think fit a more narrow niche. I might be wrong about that. Like I said, I was in prison. I don't know a lot about what was taking place out here. That's just the sense that I get.
No, so look, I'm by no means an expert on this, especially being a Canadian with a whole different
Right.
tradition of freedom and liberty in that sense. But look, here's my understanding of it: is that it's an argument that two factions of libertarians have had over the lineage, the right to have the lineage of Ludwig von Mises's thinking, right? And so you had on one side like the more, and I'm not saying more reasonable, but like the Reason magazine libertarians, right?
Right.
Or like a really good example was the late Steve Horwitz, who is passed on, but never got along with the Mises guys, but who was like an incredible scholar of Mises the man. And I know that they always butted heads, like that type of Cato libertarian, that type of
Yeah.
libertarian with the Mises Institute, which was like Lou Rockwell and Murray Rothbard and Hans Hoppe. And yeah, I really do think it is like a serious libertarian gang war that I'm not really part of at all. Um, and interestingly, like I find oh yeah, I wanted to say something about David Friedman, just as a brief aside. He's not a utilitarian. You have to be careful with that. He's an
No, I was talking about
intuition.
Milton Friedman.
Oh, Milton. Okay, I'm sorry. I thought because you're talking about anarcho-capitalists, I
No,
thought
I
you
was
were
talking about
saying,
Milton Friedman. I'm
okay,
sorry. I should have been
that's okay.
specific. You're right.
No,
But
no,
yeah,
no
no, I was talking
sweat.
about Milton.
Yeah. So I find I get along best with that type of who also has had problems with Austrians and that sort of thing. And I don't mean Austrians the nationality. I
No,
mean
yeah, yeah.
the type of Austrian associated with the Mises Institute. Um, like Mike Humer, Jason Brennan, David Friedman. These are sort of my I don't know if heroes might be too far, but teachers, I would say, right? And I find people who like them have a drastically different outlook on life too. Like my Facebook feed had a lot more Mises type libertarians, and I don't mean the man here. I mean see how confusing.
Yeah.
You're right. Like, I mean the institute people on it before, and it was a much angrier feed versus when I get a bunch of academic libertarians on there and they talk about interesting things that like I hadn't previously thought of, right? So like yeah, so I do unfortunately here's my advice to you, not that you asked. Lower your expectations for that type of person, okay? Like
Yeah.
it's just don't expect too much out of somebody who is going to be very political about their anger, because that's often what I see.
You're right. And you mentioned something earlier that jogged my memory. You mentioned it's about context and reflecting on things. I might not be remembering exactly, but it reminded me of something. The way that I came in contact with you initially was you gave me a criticism over a podcast interview I did. I
Yeah,
interviewed Mike Hume that
that's
you
right.
talked about. And the thing was, so I went back and I watched the podcast, and your criticism was, and some people were criticizing me for this, and some people were saying, no, it was appropriate, but whatever. Your criticism was that I interrupted him too much. And so I watched it and I said, he's right. I did the reflecting. Now, I'm not the type of person, like, I don't say, oh my God, I'm such an asshole, I'm a loser, I might as well just quit podcasting, screw me. You know what I mean? I just said, you know what? I interrupted too much. It was a bad day for me as far as my performance went in a discussion. I was rude. And maybe it was the sensibilities you were talking about that got me thinking about it.
Maybe.
But nevertheless, those types of sensibilities, they help to function, to facilitate discussion. And that's kind of like you're talking about the academics. I've interviewed plenty of Austrian people. I've interviewed objectivist scholars on the show. I interviewed David Friedman. He was one of my first interviews. And I never have them tell me I don't understand what they're talking about. When I get on Facebook or Twitter, I constantly have people telling me I don't know what I'm talking about when it comes to
Yeah.
objectivism or Austrian economics. And I'm just like, wow, what a difference it is.
Yeah.
You know what I
Yeah.
mean? I interviewed a guy that wrote a book about Mises. I've interviewed Austrian economists who are like, "Oh yeah, right on point. You're right on point." And then the guy on Facebook tells me, "Oh, you're so wrong," and it's like, "Oh my God!" And you're right. It ultimately boils down to my expectations. I love to debate. Like, I love debating with you. You're a respectful guy. You're nice. You're not getting angry. You differ from me. We're not going to hate each other over it. That's wonderful. some guys, or gals, you have a debate with them, and it's like their self-esteem is on the line
Yeah.
because somebody disagrees with them. And you know what? If Gerry Bourdeau is right and I'm wrong, and now look, I don't like to be wrong. Don't get me right. Don't get me wrong. I don't know anybody that does. So if I'm proven wrong, it's like a gut punch, like, ugh. But ultimately I change my view and I move on and I'm better for it. And I would rather be, have that experience than just live in an echo chamber. Does it make sense to you? Ultimately, the sort of rant I just I just gave.
Yeah. Well, look, yeah, I wouldn't. I look. The reason people argue like their personal identity is on the line is because for a lot of them it is, right. I mean,
Sure.
and I didn't like the things you're hearing me say today might still be wrong, but they're the result of years of attempts to read up on certain things, to think about certain things holistically, to see if my beliefs in one direction match the beliefs in another direction. Um, and it's a good faith attempt, right? And I I don't think that when you're going to go find an angry person who's willing to argue with you that homework has necessarily been done. And it doesn't and so yeah, like if you showed me it is possible to change my mind on things, like without getting into that weird meme that everybody shares, the change my mind table,
Oh my
like
God, it's so annoying.
yeah. but it is like I have changed my mind about all kinds of things throughout my life, and I think some people view that as like, well, why would I listen to you then? You're going to think something else. But it's like, no, I've changed it because I get more information and then I update
You do what you should do.
the credit, like the probability of something being true, and yeah, and then I move on with that new outlook. So yeah, like if you're looking for that, don't go to the Mises Caucus. No point. There's no, yeah,
Okay. Well, you brought him up, and if you've got a little bit more time, I'd like to ask you to explain. It's complicated, but in a synopsis of Hoppe's argumentation ethics.
oh God, you're gonna throw that one on me. I
Well,
should,
Gerry, I got to tell you,
yeah,
a guy told me I needed to check this out. And I,
okay.
I I read, a couple of articles by him. I watched some speeches that he gave, and to me, this was like the most ridiculous idea. Like how people, like, and people are like, this guy proved that an objective ethics with this argument. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, there's so many objections
Yeah.
I had to it. But like you said, I mean, I might be missing something. I don't know. But what is it? What is Hoppe's argumentation ethics?
Oh boy. Okay. So I am not going to hold myself out here as like
The
the
Hoppe
guy to
expert?
talk to. Yeah, exactly. And I don't know if you're noticing, I'm having some connectivity problems. I'm not sure if it's on my end or your end, but you're freezing on me a couple times there.
Am I?
So yeah. No, don't worry. It's probably my end then. So if I freeze, I'm not gone.
You
So
haven't froze on me at all.
I'll give it a shot. That's what I can promise you with Hoppe
Okay.
here. Okay. So for the argumentation ethics, if I'm put on the spot right now without having thought about this in like I don't know how long, I guess his base argument is that if you are engaging in the act of arguing, you are presupposing that the other person owns themselves, and if you are not presupposing that, then how is that possible? Because you're engaging in a performative contradiction, right? Like
Right.
I think that's if I had to, that's how I would describe that.
That's my
Um,
understanding of it as well.
yeah. So, I mean, I don't really see how that proves anything except that that's what's the phrase? It's kind of like your opinion, man. Like it's so you know, like I and I think even other Austrian folks don't necessarily agree with, or like Austrian sympathetic folks don't necessarily agree with him, which is not an argument to say he's wrong, but I don't think it's weird to think he's wrong even by that group. Um, because I mean, first of all, like you can let somebody use something without acknowledging that they own it. That's one thing. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm sure he has some pithy remark that he would shoot back about that, and somebody's yelling that at their computer right now, right? But it just seems somewhat obvious to me. You could, I know you could also engage in like a bad faith conversation.
Sure.
Um, and then he would probably say, well, then you don't really think that arguing is a means to end, uh, or a means to an end. But then it's like, yeah, but maybe I don't think that.
Yeah. So
Like you
so
haven't
what if I
proven.
don't?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm not, at least I'm not being a hypocrite, which Norm
Yeah.
Macdonald said is the worst thing you can be, right? So, um, they just had to plug another Canadian in there somewhere.
Yeah.
So, um, yeah, so I'm like the first time I read about this was probably 15 years ago, and I was thoroughly unconvinced then. I didn't prepare to take down this particular argument before showing up, but I can't think of a good reason why it might be true, which is an initial problem.
Neither can
That's
I.
yeah,
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 I'll tell you the two, maybe more, but two objections stick out to me. First of all, even if I am assuming the other person owns himself, doesn't make it so. I might just think he owns himself, and that's why I'm arguing with him, and I might be wrong. But the second thing is, I might be having the conversation with him and trying to persuade him. Maybe I can't physically dominate him, but if I could, I would. You know what I mean? Maybe I'm talking to a guy, as many times having spent 25 years in prison.
yeah,
I had a lot of debates with guys that could have knocked my head off. So what if I'm just trying to persuade them because they'll kill me in a fight? And then what about the people who don't engage in arguments, who just use force? What about them? They're just going and doing it. So how does their actions imply self-ownership? I just found it like there's certain things in life, like arguments I've read, that I find ridiculous. There's arguments I've read that I disagree with, but I can say, wow, that is a strong point. Reparations is one of them. I don't think reparations for slaves in America should be done. But I think that the opposition, people that think they should happen, have some valid points. That argumentation ethic, I don't see it at all.
yeah. I don't like. Remember, you're talking to a person who thinks that human behavior is explained entirely by physical game theoretic reasons.
Well, that's true
Um,
too.
right. And so like this might be another reason, if you accept that, which I know you don't, but that's okay, to not think that Hoppy's argument is terribly interesting at all. Right. Like I don't see in any way how it would override my sort of like universe's worldview, my worldview. I don't know why that argument would affect it. There are other things that you could say to me that might affect this. You could show me certain things that would affect my belief about the physical world. The guy, and I know, I think I mentioned this last time on your podcast too, and I seem to plug him all the time. The guy that comes closest to doing this is Mike Humer. And I know he drives you nuts in certain ways with his seemings, right? Because you mentioned, I'm not saying that Mike Humer personally, the guy drives you nuts, but like
No.
his argument about seemings, and yet like when I read ethical intuitionism, that's the closest I've come to being convinced of objective morals. Um, to the point that I have to sit and think about it. I did not get struck by like Hans Hoppe, his argumentation ethics in the same way. We're like, oh man, this guy is really on. And you know what? I'm going to say something that's going to drive every Mises libertarian nuts. Okay.
You mean the Mises Caucus guys, right? Okay.
Yes, not the Mises the man. The Mises Caucus guys. There's a reason that academics don't give a shit about the argumentation ethics, right? Like if it was really, really mind blowing, right? It would get printed, it would get picked up. Philosophers would argue about it endlessly. Like Mike Humer, his book on ethical intuitionism was published. He has a bunch of papers on it. People do argue with him about it, right? Like it gets noticed. It doesn't mean it's right. It's just like clearly there's more deep thought going into this that other smart people grab and will argue about. And I know that people have disdain for the academy. I'm not an academic, although I have many university degrees. People will just go, oh well, that's why you're going to stick up for the academy. But I'm sorry, if you come up with something amazing, someone in the academy will notice. And it's like Hans Hoppe is just, look, if it wasn't for the Mises Institute, we wouldn't be talking about him. Okay. We'd still be talking about Robert Nozick. We would. Absolutely. We'd know Robert Nozick, but we would have no idea who Hans Hoppe is. And we would still know who Mises is, but we wouldn't know who Hans Hoppe is. Like, it doesn't, you know what I mean? It's just not something that's, and I know this is not a direct argument against the argument. I'm just explaining that sometimes you get struck by good ideas that seem deep and you have to untangle them. And then other times you get a just so story that can be dismissed because it doesn't actually bring up anything interesting. And I think that oh man, I'm not going to be making friends with this at all, but I think that's what Hoppe has done. I also look, while I'm on it, if you can indulge me for another 2 minutes of Hoppe bashing,
go ahead.
His book on what's it called, the one where he's talking about why royal society, kings and queens, why royalty is better. Was it Democracy, the God That Failed? I think that's what it is, right? Read through this book. Everybody on Facebook, oh, this book is so good and whatever. I remember I read through it and I thought, he cites his buddies through the whole damn thing. There's not a single empirical hard piece of data in this that anybody had to stop and work for. Nobody had to get a p-value on it. Nobody had to do any statistical reasoning whatsoever to make this book. Like, you can come up with a just so story that will explain all kinds of things in your mind, but then you have to go out and test it. And like that, most people release their book after that portion, the I went out and tested it portion. But I find that he's got this habit of like, I came up with the just so story and I'm releasing that. Right. So if I didn't anyway, by the way, there are some people from the Mises Institute that I like. So I don't want everybody who's watching this from the Mises Institute to think that I don't like them, because there are several people who I think have produced really valuable work, are very smart people and that sort of thing. But I just don't find Hoppe convincing. And I really find the people that are attracted to that stuff to be very unconvincing and just really pointless to talk to. So
yeah, there's people at the Mises Institute who I get in my email feed articles, and there's plenty of them that I like. Mark Thornton's one that I think he's great. Jonathan Newman, I've had both of them on. I thought they were both great. But it's the Mises Caucus, folks. And it doesn't mean everybody that's in the Mises Caucus. I'm just talking about the loudest ones that I run across on Facebook and Twitter. And then I've read their whatever it is, their charter or their mission statement.
Yeah.
And that's my issue. And just so, if anyone's saying, oh, well, maybe you wouldn't argue this out with Hoppe. I did send Hoppe an email and told him I'd love to have him on to debate his argumentation ethics. Now, I understand he's Hoppe and he's kind of a big deal in the movement, and I'm just some schmuck. Maybe he looks at it like that, and that's fine. But I can only do what I can do. I offered to debate him. I've offered to debate Dave Smith. I've offered to debate Scott Horton. And their followers on Facebook and Twitter. Well, who are you? Okay, I'm a nobody. And if that's the standard, that's fine. But what I was responding to, Gerry, is they had a picture, and the people that were posting were basically calling Ben Shapiro a coward. And they said Ben Shapiro won't debate Dave Smith or Scott Horton. He's a coward. So my response was, okay, well, they won't debate me. So what does so the point, if that's the logic, because someone won't debate, then they're a coward. Well, they won't debate me. So I'm not just on a podcast. My point is, I'm not just here saying things without giving somebody an opportunity to correct me or to argue with me. I'd be more than happy to debate any of the people that we've been talking about in any format, public or private. I just want to be clear about that.
So I have my own podcast, and I think I have a very different take on this, which is that I wouldn't, even if Hans Hoppe sent me an email, not because I'm so good and I'm so popular or anything, I wouldn't bother debating it because I don't find it interesting. Like, there's no point to me. I wouldn't get anything out of it. I'd rather actually find somebody who is credible and has even more opposite views to me, and have like a debate like that, instead of just finding the guy that attracts a lot of anger and just having him on for the hell of it.
I think you're probably right.
Yeah, so.
It's one of my things is, well, first of all, I think debate's very important. And I really am like maybe offended by, maybe is the word, by the Mises Caucus people. Only because, like I said, I've called myself a libertarian for a long time. I think that the arguments for liberty are very strong. And I think that people like that bastardize it. I think they ruin it. And I think much like, I think, by the way, Donald Trump, when people say Donald Trump is an advocate of capitalism, it's like, no, he's not. Like him if you want, worship him, shine his damn shoes. I really don't care, but he's not an advocate for capitalism. So that's kind of how I look at it. Your attitude, though, about if they're not interesting, why bother, is something I really respect. And it may be the avenue that I end up taking. I don't know yet, but I do respect it. And I think you're onto something. All right, Gerry, do you have anything more that you want to, anybody else you want to bash? Feel free.
No, quite the opposite. I'd just like to say really quickly that, first of all, thank you, Michael, for having me back. Second of all,
anytime. I think you're great.
I hope people check out Argue With Me, my podcast. I've only released 2 episodes, but I have 8 recorded, and I think you're going to like a lot of the people that are on there. I've got, I also actually did an interview with David Friedman. I've got Mike Humer on there already, but I have a lot of good ones too, like Vincent Geloso. You're going to like that one, Michael, because he and I talk about anarcho-capitalism. He's a historian of economics. He's fantastic, and he's super smart. And he brought up a lot of stuff about anarcho-capitalism that I think you'd be sympathetic with, actually. So anyway, so I hope people check that out. And that's it. Thanks again for having me.
Thanks a lot, Gerry. And anytime, you're a great antagonist here on the show.
All right.
For now, this is the Rational Egoist signing out. I'm Michael Liebowitz. Remember, please leave your comments. Let me know what you think. It's important for the direction of the show and to show that we have people that are interested. Till next time.